Hello everyone, can you hear me? Yeah, you can, okay. All right, thank you very much for joining us today for the visa training. I understand it's still quite a busy time for most of you. Today's training will be delivered by our visa compliance manager, Ian, who will kind of walk us through the November UKVI changes for you, and we will also explain how these changes could impact the students who are going to apply for our courses, both in the international study centers and the Philippines colleges. We will be leaving some time for questions by end of the session as well. So if you have any questions, please do bear with us and type in the chat place so we can answer later. This webinar will also be recorded as well. So we can send you the recording later once the session is finished to share with your colleagues or students who want to watch later. So now let's welcome Ian to start the training for us.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks very much, Zoe. As Zoe said, I'm the Visa Compliance Manager for Study Group, looking after all of the Study Group brands for Bellerbys colleges and the ISCs. We hopefully going to enlighten you with the recent changes that the UKVI made to the Tier 4 policy, and as Zoe said, outlining the impact they have both in general for students, so that the students are aware, but also specifically the implications for Bellerbys and international study centres. So we've got 4 topics that we're going to be looking at. They all had changes made to them in November. The first 2, the changes to the secure English language tests, the CELTs, and the changes to the monthly living costs, they are relatively simple, and so we will go over those to make sure everybody is aware of those changes, but we will spend the majority of the time on the slightly more complicated changes around the maximum time students are allowed to study below degree level, and also the changes as to whether students are eligible to apply inside the UK or not. So starting off with the secure English language test changes. This came into effect on the 5th of November, and it was the end of a transitional arrangement that the UKVI had in place, which connected to a change they made back in April 2015, I'm sure you all remember, where since April 2015 new tests have been only valid as a CELT if they are the UKVI approved IELTS taken at a UKVI approved testing centre. Since April until recently, we were able to accept some old type of CELT tests, such as Pearson and some of the Cambridge CAE, etc. That was a transitional arrangement based on when the student took the test and when the student was going to apply for their visa. However, since the 5th of November, that transitional arrangement has now ended, and all students that need a CELT must have a new UKVI IELTS taken at a UKVI approved testing centre. The IELTS testing centres are available worldwide, so both in the UK and testing centres around the world. The thing the students need to be very aware of is that even at approved UKVI approved testing centres, they must ensure that when they are booking the IELTS test, they are booking the UKVI approved test. It is possible to take a non-UKVI approved IELTS at the approved testing centres, so they need to make sure that they have chosen the right type of test while they're making that booking. The link there, and as Zoe said, we will send this presentation around, so you can click on that link. That will take you to the UKVI CELT testing centre list, and that shows all the available UKVI approved testing centres around the world for IELTS, and obviously students need to book their IELTS at those relevant centres. It is also possible, there is one other valid CELT type from the 5th of November, which is the Integrated Skills in English, which is a Trinity College London test. There are 10 UK centres available to take an approved CELT. It's not very popular, unfortunately, but it is technically a valid CELT if your students are in the UK and have if there is no option for a UKVI IELTS, then there is a sort of second option. They can book one of those tests at a Trinity College testing centre in the UK. Those approved testing centres can also be found on that same list. But for the majority of students, it is now just the UKVI approved IELTS as the only valid CELT that's available. There are, just as a reminder, there are various reasons in which a student can be exempt from CELT. And just to remind you, they are obviously for Bellaby's College only. Students applying as a Tier 4 child, they are exempt from the CELT requirements, so students do not need to provide a specific CELT test. We will need to see evidence of their English language ability to be able to assess them for their course, but it does not need to be a UKVI approved CELT. It can be any English test. Equally, for any centre, Bellaby's or the ISEs, students that are applying as a Tier 4 general but do have study history and have completed a course as a Tier 4 child, as long as that course was at least 6 months long, and it's very, very important that they completed it and successfully completed it. And successfully completed means they achieved the qualification for which they were studying. That's how the UKVI determine whether they successfully completed or not. But if a student has completed a course as a Tier 4 child, then their next application, even as a Tier 4 general, they will be again exempt from the CELT requirements. Obviously, for any student that's had a UK study history, that's something we can check to see if we can waive the CELT requirement. Equally, depending on a student's nationality, which will always be determined based on the nationality indicated in their passport, but if they are from any of those listed countries and that nationality shows on their passport, then they are exempt from the CELT requirement. And then finally, any student nationality who has studied and achieved a qualification that is equivalent to a UK degree but has studied it in one of those countries, regardless of the nationality of the student, they are also exempt from the CELT requirements. So they are the ways in which students can be exempt from CELT, but as mentioned before, if they are not exempt, and if they do need to show a CELT in order to get a CAS and to apply for their Tier 4 visa, then since the 5th of November, that now has to be a UKVI approved IELTS taken at one of the UKVI approved testing centres. Moving on to the next area, as I said, the CELT and the fees parts are relatively straightforward. So we'll go over this. The monthly living costs. Sorry, wrong one. They have done three main changes to the monthly living costs that students need to, that form part of the calculation that determines how much a student must show in their bank account. The three things that they have changed are they have increased the amount, both for Tier 4 General and for Tier 4 Chards, but we'll look at that in more detail in a minute. They have also changed the definition of when a student is considered studying in London and outside London. And as we will see in a minute, that has implications on some of our Bellerbys colleges and also our international study centres, as more institutes are now included within the definition of being in London, and therefore any student studying at a site that is considered in London has to have a higher amount than other students, which we will look at in a second. And then finally, the third thing that they have now introduced, again, this is all since the 12th of November, is that they have ended the established presence concept. For those who are not aware, that was students that have previously studied in the UK could be eligible to qualify as having established presence, and that meant that they had to show a reduced amount of money in their account, so it was quite beneficial to the student. They only needed to show 2 months of the living costs rather than the usual 9 months. However, since the 12th of November, the established presence has been removed. Therefore, all students, whether that is the first time they are coming to the UK or whether they have previously studied or not, all students must now show the standard calculation of the monthly living costs up to 9 months. As I mentioned, looking specifically from the International Study Centre point of view first, the changes to in London and outside London mean that you can see now the list of ISCs that are considered in London and the ones that are considered outside London. And they're from, it says the 14th of November, that's specifically, it's the 14th or the 12th. It's because the UKVI were actually a bit late releasing the policy, but that doesn't matter. In London, those centres there, any student studying at one of the in London ISCs with the new increased amount must now have £1,265 per month. So that's for the duration of the course. If the course is less than 9 months, for example, if they are studying a course that is 6 months long, then they need to have 6 months of £1,265 in their account, plus any outstanding tuition fees. Or if the course duration is over 9 months, then it's always a maximum of 9 months that they have to show. So it would be 9 times 1,265. As mentioned before, there is no more established presence. Therefore, even if a student has previous UK study history, they must now show the amount based on calculation of their course length, or up to 9 months if their course is longer than that. The students studying at a site outside of London, at any of those international study centres listed there, they are now required to show £1,015, as shown there. And again, same as before, no more established presence, and the calculation is based on course duration or up to 9 months. So, as I said, it's had a change from before. With the international study centres, we only had one ISC that was considered in London. That used to be the Istituto Marangoni Centre, but with the new definition of what is considered in London, we now have a few more that fall within that consideration. Therefore, students, for example, going to Kingston previously they wouldn't have been considered studying at an in-London centre because of the geographic determination. But now that has changed. Anybody going to Kingston or the University of Law or Coventry, still Marangoni and also Royal Holloway, they all must take into account the increased and much higher amount that is required. For Bellevis, there is a slight change. In terms of the increased living costs amount, the Bellevis College London is now considered in London, which may seem obvious, but previously it did not fall within the boundaries of being in London, but now it does. Therefore, any student, any Tier 4 general student, and any Tier 4 child in private accommodation over 16, any of those types of students, as highlighted there, if they are studying in London, then they have to, if they're studying at Bellevis London, they have to have the £1,265 amount. Any of those types of student, the Tier 4 general or the child in private, if they are studying at the other Bellevis colleges, they obviously will be considered outside London, and they need the 1,015 per month amount. Again, with Bellevis, same with the ISEs, no more established presence, therefore all students need the usual calculation. Specifically for Bellevis only, for Tier 4 child students that are staying in Bellevis host family or Bellevis residence, they have a very specific calculation. They are not impacted by the living costs change because living costs do not apply to Tier 4 child students at Bellevis staying in host family or residence. That is because they are considered residential boarding students. Even if they are in host family, they are still considered residential boarding students. And as such, there is actually no change for these types of students. And as I said, the living costs calculation does not factor in, and the amount of money required for those specific types of students is actually tuition fees for the first year, plus the accommodation fees for the first year. It's those two fees combined, and then minus anything the student has paid, and the outstanding balance is what the student is required to hold in their bank account or parents' bank account accordingly. They do not have to factor in the monthly amount regardless of where they are going. So for all 4 Bellevis colleges, if it is a Tier 4 child staying with Bellevis accommodation, the calculation, which will be indicated on the CAS, it's a combination of first year's tuition and first year's accommodation, and it's the outstanding balance of those minus anything the student has paid. So that was the, as I said, the changes to, or the end to the transitional arrangement for the CELT requirements, so that we can no longer accept any other type of CELT except the UKVI IELTS, outlined the possible exemptions to that for Tier 4 child or students that previously studied as Tier 4 child, etc. And the increase and change to the monthly living costs, the in and out of London changes. You've got those slides, you will have those slides eventually for you to reference. But those changes, I believe, are relatively simple. There's no major difference to the process. It's just the actual, for example, with the living cost, it's just a slightly increased amount, but the actual process and what the student is required to present as part of their application in terms of their finances has not changed. It will just now result in a higher amount required. The next 2 sections we will look at are admittedly a little bit more complex, but we hope that this will clarify things for you, both in general and specifically in relation to Bellerbys and the ISCs. We're starting with the changes to the maximum time limit allowed for students to study below degree level. And degree level, the UKVI classify any course below NQF6. Degrees are NQF6, and so anything NQF6 and above is considered degree level. So anything below that, there is now some changes to the maximum time allowed. For the students, the maximum time it counts for English courses if the English course was studied on a Tier 4 visa, a Tier 4 general visa, as you will see. But if a student did do English, whether that is English that was part of a wider study plan, including the academic course, or whether that was an English-only course studied as a Tier 4 general, that will count towards the below degree level limit. So that's something that has to be taken into account. Equally, for Bellerbys and for the ICs, we offer NQF3 and NQF4 courses, and so those courses are considered below degree level and therefore will can count towards the maximum time allowed. The time limit is specifically only for Tier 4 general students. Tier 4 child are exempt, which we will look at in a minute. I will show you all the variations of exemptions, but the maximum time relates only to Tier 4 general students. The main change from November is that the time allowed to study below degree level has changed from 3 years to 2 years. This is calculated based on visa length, and for those of you that may remember in August, the August changes, the UKVI introduced that specific change where before August, time calculated was based on the course length, not the visa length. But in August 2015, the UKVI, they did not reduce the time allowed, but they did change the way the time was calculated, and they changed it to the calculation based on the visa length. So therefore, the period the student gets on their visa that is before the course starts and the period they get after the course ends must now be included in the calculation. And so we need to see the visa because we will have to calculate any previous study based on the visa length. Equally, the visa length is looked at to determine how much a student has studied, and any remaining amount of time, the new course, we have to look at the length of the visa that the student will get. So if it's a 9-month course, for example, the student will generally tend to get an 11-month visa because of the bit before and the bit after, maybe even a 12-month visa, and we will calculate how much the visa they will get, and they have to have sufficient time remaining to get the visa length, not based on the course duration. But we're going to look at a few examples that will hopefully make that a bit clearer, so don't worry. Equally, there are a lot of exemptions. There's a lot of period of study that we can ignore, and that is exempt, and therefore will not count towards the 2-year limits. The exemptions are here, so any period that falls within the exemption does not count towards the 2-year limit, and therefore we won't include that in any calculation we make as to determine whether we are able to issue a student a CAS. Any period as a Tier 4 child, and that equally means any period as a Tier 4 child if the student subsequently becomes 18 years old whilst they are studying on that Tier 4 child visa. It doesn't matter if they become 18, the full duration of their studies on that Tier 4 child visa will be exempt from the 2-year limit. Equally, any previous study as a Tier 4 general under 18 is exempt. Therefore, student, as we know, 16, 17-year-olds, especially for foundation, they have to have a Tier 4 general. But any period they are studying on that Tier 4 general, whilst they are under 18, is exempt. Therefore, with such students, we would look at the 18th birthday and calculate from the 18th birthday to the end of the visa. And that will be the period that we calculate towards the 2-year limit, not the full visa length. But we will look when they became 18 during those studies. Obviously, if they were 18 when they started, then we would include the full period. But we can ignore anything as a Tier 4 general whilst under 18. Equally, it is possible for students to study under many different types of visa, not just Tier 4. The most common being the short-term student visa route, used to be named as the student visitor visa. Any study on that route, or the extended student visitor visa, the 11-month version, or the child visitor visa, or if there's any other visa type that has enabled the student to study legitimately, Tier 5, dependent visas, anything else, any study on a non-Tier 4 visa is also exempt. So that's something we will take into account, and we can ignore any of that study period. It's becoming more and more rare as it becomes more and more in the past, but it is still valid that if a student has previously studied, and it was a long time ago, before the 31st of March 2009, that is also exempt, because that would have been a period under the old student visa rules, and therefore that is equally exempt. So if you do have one of those, we can ignore that period. And finally, a period after a curtailment letter has been issued can be exempt. Now, this one can be a little bit complicated and a bit tricky, but in theory, if a student has stopped studying partway through their course for whatever reason, the current Tier 4 sponsor should report that student to the UKVI in line with their responsibilities. Now, in theory, what happens next is that based on that reporting that the sponsor has stopped sponsoring the student, the UKVI should then issue the student with a curtailment letter if there is more than 60 days left on the student's visa. Therefore, what they do is they curtail the visa to 60 days from the date of the reporting. If the student did terminate and was issued a curtailment letter, then we would calculate that period of study from, if they were 18, for example, we would calculate it from beginning of the visa up to the curtailment date. And then any period of the visa after that we can ignore because the visa was curtailed to the specific date. If the, as I said, if the student had less than 60 days left on their visa, they would not be issued a curtailment letter, and therefore we would have to take into account the full length of their visa, regardless of when the student stopped studying. And equally, if for any reason the student does not have a curtailment letter, that could cause us some problems, and the only way we could resolve that, if they felt that they should have had a curtailment letter and therefore they should have had their visa curtailed and therefore we should calculate a much smaller amount, in those instances we would probably have to check with our UKVI account manager to look into the history of that student and take advice from UKVI as to exactly how much previous study would count towards that 2-year limit. Based on that answer, then that's when obviously we would advise yourselves and the student that according to UKVI, we have to calculate X number of months or whatever, and then we would discuss the options with you and the student as to what we could or couldn't do based on the remaining time that the student has. So the curtailment is an option if a student has curtailed and therefore has a shorter period. We will take that into account, but as I said, it's UKVI don't necessarily process that as well as they should, and therefore there can be a lot of confusion and complication. But any such problems we will just check with our UKVI contact to determine exactly how much the student has previously studied. But all of those options are exempt, therefore there are often many situations when a student has previously studied that we can ignore that period and it does not count towards their 2-year limit, which obviously is very beneficial for the student. So hopefully trying to put that into some sort of realistic context, I've got 3 example students that I hope will sort of cement those concepts as to exactly how much we would calculate and how much a student has left and what the implications are for those students. So you've got student A, he's done an NQF3, it's a foundation course, very standard, therefore general of course. He's 19, so he's been over 18 for the full duration. And it's just to clarify, as you can see, although the foundation course dates would total 9 months, because the visa length would be 12 months, then that student has used up 12 months of their 2-year limit. So in essence, they've used up half, and that means they have a remaining 12 months. However, the remaining 12 months that they have means they have to be studying a course that will give them a visa length of 12 months or less. If any new course that they want to study below degree level, if any new below degree level course would result in a visa length of over 12 months, then they would be refused. Even if the course length was, for example, 10 months, then that would probably result in a visa of around 13 months. Therefore, the student would be refused, therefore we would not be able to issue that student with a CAS, because obviously it would fall for automatic refusal. As long as, based on the course length, based on the period they will be granted before and after, if that visa length is less than 12 months, then for this student, then we would be in a position to issue a CAS. Obviously subject to all the usual progression requirements, higher level or same level may be possible, but they would have to go home, etc. But in essence, if they've got 12 months left and if the new course would result in a visa length of less than 12 months, then they will be eligible to get a new CAS. As I said, it's all about visa length and not course length. If in this example the proposed course length would result in a visa length of over 12 months, that is obviously something we would look at, and we would work with yourselves and the student to see if there is a alternative solution to enable that student to study. There are various things we could do if it was determined that the student definitely needed more English, and that was part of the reason that the course duration was going to be over 12 months. Then obviously the options are able that the student study the English on the short-term student visa first. That period is exempt, therefore the student could study the English part, short-term student visa, return home, and then we could issue a CAS for the main academic course, which would be shorter and therefore would enable the student to have a visa of less than 12 months long and come and study that course. So we will always try and find the most suitable study plan for your students, and one of the things now that we will have to take into account is this calculation. But as I said, we will always first of all try and use all of the exemptions possible based on their previous study, and then having used all of those exemptions, whatever is the amount remaining, then we will do our very best to ensure that the study plan available to the student will not result in a visa refusal, because obviously that will be beneficial for both the student and ourselves, as we can't have any visa refusals with the very controlled metrics against sponsors. Looking at another student, just as an example to try and cement this, very common situation, A levels in QF3, therefore it's below degree level, but because 16 or 17-year-olds can apply as a Tier 4 child to study A levels, you may have a situation, Tier 4 child, but the student started in September 2013 and became 18 in October 2013, so very, very shortly after he arrived. So therefore the majority of his 20-month course and his 25-month visa, he's been over 18. However, as the full duration of the Tier 4 child visa is exempt, that means we can ignore all of that previous study history, and therefore this student still has the full 2 years below degree level available as a Tier 4 general. Obviously, having become 18, the next visa that the student applies for will have to be a Tier 4 general, but we can ignore the full duration, and therefore full 2 years is available, and subject to all the usual progression issues, the student could have a CAS for a below degree level course, and as long as the visa they get will be less than 2 years, which is highly likely, then they will be fine. And then the final example, just to hopefully clarify further, this time the student has done some Tier 4 child study but as a GCSE, which is NQF2, and then did a foundation at NQF3 as a Tier 4 general. But the student turned 18 on the 12th of October, which if you look at the foundation course dates, he started that on the 12th of July 2014, so a few months after starting that foundation course, the student turned 18. So the GCSE studied as a Tier 4 child, as before, that is exempt for the full duration, therefore we can ignore the GCSE visa, 13 months, and so the student has still got the full 2 years. Then we look at the foundation course as Tier 4 general. Now, although the visa length was 15 months, the student only became 18 on the 12th of October. So any study period before the 12th of October on that Tier 4 general is also exempt. Therefore, what we end up with is a calculation of the 12th of October, the 18th birthday, up to the visa expiry date, which is the 16th of August. And instead of a 15-month period, obviously we're now left with a 12-month period, because we're just going from the 18th birthday to the end of the visa for the foundation. So in this example, the student will have used 12 months of study and therefore has available a further 12 months of below degree level study. And again, as long as the next course would deliver a visa of less than 12 months, then they will be eligible to study that course below degree level. So I hope those sort of examples kind of clarify the situation. It is a slightly complicated situation. However, we're happy to help the admissions team if you send, you have any potential students for Bellaviz or for the ISCs. If you send your the full visa history to your usual admissions contacts, then we work with them, or they're trained as well to calculate these periods themselves, and therefore we will then be able to advise you on how much is left, and therefore based on how much is left, advise a suitable study plan to, as best possible, fit within any remaining study period below degree level. As I said, there are many exemptions, there are many different solutions, and so I think for most students we would hope that we can find a suitable solution if no one else can. We'll just need all the visa copies to be able to figure that out, and of course the student's birthday, and we can advise and help you accordingly, subject to all the usual progression issues. I hope that's clarified the below degree level situation. Then that leads us finally on to the last section, which is the changes as to which students are eligible to submit a visa application inside the UK. Again, talk you through the sort of the general concepts and then very specifically the implications on Belabis and the ISEs, as there are a lot of differences because a lot of the eligibility is based on the institute type, which we'll have a look at. But the rules in general are whether or not a student is now eligible to submit an application inside the UK of any type is based on the main two things, which is what visa type they're on when they're currently in the UK, whether it's a child or a general. And also the second main thing is what is their current institute type. And that is the main thing. It's the current institute type. It is not related to where they want to go. It's all about they are in the UK on a visa with a CAS from a specific institute type. What is that institute type currently? And it's irrelevant where they're going next. The institute type is now, if you have seen, it's been there for a number of weeks now, but if you look at the Tier 4 Register of Sponsors, which lists all the Tier 4 sponsors that can issue CASs to students, for several weeks now that has indicated the institute type as to what the UKVI classify that institute type as. So that's what we will be using when a student wants to come to us. We will look at where they previously were to determine whether they are eligible to apply, and we will look at the institute type based on this register of sponsors, and that will determine whether or not the student is eligible to apply in the UK or not, because it's not about whether they are coming to us, it's about where they are or where they previously were. That's the main factor. So if we split it into looking at Tier 4 Child and Tier 4 General, because they're looked at slightly differently, and then we will look at the implications to Belabis and ISE separately. So for Tier 4 Child students, if the student is in the UK as a Tier 4 Child, then they are eligible to apply inside the UK, regardless of what type of institute. Now the little sort of note there, as you can see at the bottom, that's because since August, new Tier 4 Child students can only go to an independent school, such as Belabis College is an independent school, and therefore it's only Belabis that can issue new Tier 4 Child CASs. However, because a lot of students applied as Tier 4 Child before the changes to go to the ISEs and to go to many other institute types, those Tier 4 Child visas are still valid, and therefore they could be, there will be for a period sort of through until next year, there will probably be quite a number of students at Tier 4 Child visas at non-independent schools, which is perfectly valid because they can continue to study until their visa expires. So therefore, any Tier 4 Child or any institute type, if they're in the UK as a Tier 4 Child, they are eligible to submit their visa application inside the UK if they want to transfer over to Belabis or to the ISEs. Those Tier 4 Child students, they can apply for anything. So if it's to extend their current course or to progress to their next course or to a change institute. Obviously, that can be done inside the UK, and also whether that's being done to their next application as a child or as a general. Obviously, if they are in the UK as a child at a non-independent school, then if they want to continue with that same institute, then their next application will have to be a Tier 4 general. However, they will still be eligible to do that within the UK. Need to clarify as well that when we're talking about eligibility to apply inside the UK or not, the standard rules still apply, and the standard rules are that if a student is going to study a new course, whether it's the same institute or a different institute, there has to be less than 28 days between their visa expiring and the start of the new course. If there's less than 28 days and they're a Tier 4 child, then they can apply inside the UK. If it's longer than 28 days, they have to go home regardless. This does not, the new rules do not override the requirement that there has to be less than 28 days. So if there is more than 28 days, even if they are a Tier 4 child, they have to go home and apply from their home country. So that's something to factor in as well. Looking at Tier 4 generals, Tier 4 generals, it's very much about where they currently are studying, as I mentioned. And if they are currently studying at either a higher education institute, which is university, or an embedded college offering a pathway program, then they are eligible to submit an application inside the UK. As I said, that's where that eligibility comes from, where they are currently studying at one of those two types of institute. As you will see later on, the international study centres, the vast majority, there are a couple that won't be, which I'll clarify, but almost all of the international study centres are classified as embedded colleges offering pathway programs. Therefore, students studying at the ISEs considered an embedded college will be eligible to apply inside the UK, but I will show you that in more detail in a moment. If the Tier 4 general students not studying at those two types of institute, they're studying at any other type of institute, as again as outlined on that Tier 4 register of sponsors list. If the visa that they have is from a different institute type, then they have to go home, regardless of what the reason is that they are applying for their new visa. Even if it is an extension to their current course, if they are currently studying at an institute that is not a university or not an embedded college, then they have to go home. Same as with the Tier 4 child, for the Tier 4 general eligibility, even if they are eligible to apply based on the institute type, the standard rules also still apply, and therefore the student has to meet the progression requirements to be able to apply inside the UK. So if they are applying for a higher level and studying at an embedded college, then that's okay. However, if they are trying to study the same level, then it doesn't matter whether they are eligible based on their institute type. All students, all Tier 4 general students that want to study the same level have to go home. Again, the new rules do not override the progression rules. So if a student is trying to study the same level, they have to go home. That doesn't include extensions. It's a little bit different, but we'll look at that in a bit more detail in a minute. But for new courses, if they're trying to do the same level, then they have to go home regardless. And equally, as mentioned before, the 28-day rule still applies. So if there's longer than 28 days, all Tier 4 general students have to go home. So it's a combination of the new rules based on their institute type, but also the old current policy around progression and around the 28-day rules also still apply and have to be factored in. Looking at the impact on Berlebys and the ISE specifically, So we're going to look at two things. We're going to look at students wishing to transfer to Bellerbys or the ISEs, so they are studying somewhere else currently, and they want to transfer, whether it's at the end of the course or in the middle of the course. But if they want to studying at any place they want to transfer, this is the implications for both Bellerbys and the ISEs. If the student is in the UK as a Tier 4 child, as we mentioned before, wherever they are, if they're in the UK as a Tier 4 child, they want to progress or they want to transfer to Bellerbys or the ISEs, subject to the progression and 28-day requirements, as I mentioned. But if they're in the UK as a Tier 4 child, then they will hopefully be eligible, if they meet all the other requirements, to submit their application for Bellerbys or ISE inside the UK. If they are a Tier 4 general studying and they want to transfer to Bellerbys or the ISEs, it's all about, as we said, it's all about where they are currently studying. So we would look at where they are studying with that Tier 4 general, and if they are at a university or at an embedded college, whether that's one of the ISEs or a different embedded college, then if it's a Tier 4 general student, then again, subject to progression and 28-day rulings, then those students should be eligible to apply inside the UK. However, if it's a Tier 4 general studying at a different institute type, then to study with Bellerbys or the ISEs, the student will have to go home first and make their application from their home country. So that's students transferring to Bellerbys and ISEs, and as I said, it's all about where they currently are, not where they want to go. That's why the rules are equally applicable to Bellerbys and ISEs when the student's transferring from somewhere else. So it's all about what they're doing currently. Looking at the impact on Bellerbys and ISE current students, so those students that are with us, you might have sent us students that are already at Bellerbys or the ISEs, or students that are already booked to come in January, looking at the implications for them. Obviously they are in the UK or will be in the UK with us, therefore that is what then determines their eligibility or not for the next application that they make, whether that's with us or with another institute when they progress. So the impact for both Bellerbys and ISEs for current Tier 4 child students is that they will be eligible to make their next application inside the UK, subject to all the usual progression things. But as I mentioned, there will be still some Tier 4 child students at the ISEs. If there are Tier 4 child students at the ISEs, they are fine to continue studying, and also they will be eligible to make their next application in the UK, and equally for Bellerbys. Obviously we have a lot of Tier 4 child students in Bellerbys, and they will be eligible to, whether that's to extend or progress onto the next course or resit an exam or progress onto the degree, subject to the usual progression and 28-day rules. Those students will be eligible because they're in the UK as a Tier 4 child. Tier 4 general students at the ISEs, all ISEs except 3, all except 3 will be considered or are considered embedded colleges offering pathway programs, and therefore students studying at all of those ISEs will be eligible to apply inside the UK. Again, subject to the usual progression and 28 days, but if they're at the ISE and they want to do an extension, or if they want to resit a program, or they want to progress to the next course at the ISE, then they will be eligible to apply inside the UK because they will be considered studying at an embedded college. The 3 that will not be considered embedded colleges are Instituto Marangoni, the University of Law ISE, and Coventry University London Campus ISE. They are not considered embedded colleges because of the way they are set up, the UKVI. So those students studying at those ISEs will have to go home to make a Tier 4 application. And equally, at the moment, Tier 4 general students at Bellerbys College must also return home. to make any kind of Tier 4 application. We are very heavily lobbying the UKVI to change that, and we are optimistic that they will allow independent schools, which is Bellerby's College, that Tier 4 general students at independent schools will be eligible. At present, it's not the case, so I can't promise that. However, we and also various other bodies from the same sector, some of our counterparts, we're all working together, the independent school sector, and the UKVI have responded very favourably to that, and so we are optimistic. However, at the present, until we have more news on that, the rule at the moment is that Tier 4 general students have to go home. Obviously, as soon as we have any news on that, we will update you. So that's the eligibility to apply inside the UK, and that's me. I hope that has clarified some of those changes. Obviously, you will have the slides to review in sort of your own time. Hopefully, there's enough information there for you to go through again if you need to understand it. But I think now we'll open it up to any questions that you may have. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Ian. That was really helpful, especially with the case studies. I found that really helpful anyway. So I can see that there are a few questions here already. The first question was, does the student need to take only the academic IELTS, or are they allowed to take the general one? I guess it's asking if the student can take the normal IELTS other than the IELTS for UKVI for any applications.
Yeah, I believe if they are, when they are booking to take the test, they, as I said, they have to make sure they are taking the test for UKVI purposes. And I believe, and I could be wrong because I haven't seen the application form recently, but I believe if they do select the IELTS for UKVI purposes, then it is always going to be the academic version anyway. However, if when booking the student books an IELTS that is specifically for UKVI purposes, and then they have an option for general academic, we would always recommend that they take the academic, because obviously they are coming to study, and therefore it's only the IELTS academic test that will give an accurate representation of the student's English level.
Okay, thanks. And there are agents asking if the IELTS for UKVI is required if students are applying for Tier 4 child student visa.
No, they, as you see on the handout, the Tier 4 child is one of the exemptions. So therefore, students applying as a Tier 4 child do not need to have a UKVI CELT. Therefore, they can provide us with an English test that accurately represents their English ability, and we can accept that as proof of their English accordingly.
Okay, thank you. And there's also another agent asking if the student is under a Tier 4 dependent visa, are they required to provide IELTS for UKVI as well?
No, as long as the dependent visa entitles them to study with us based on that dependent visa, which it normally does, then the student does not need a CAS or a new visa, and therefore we will not need a UKVI IELTS because they will not need to make a Tier 4 application. Therefore we can accept, again, any kind of English language test to assess their ability. If the student moves into the Tier 4 general category, maybe because their dependent visa is expiring or something, then the student will need to have a UKVI IELTS. But if they are studying on their dependent visa, then there's no CELT requirement. Therefore, we can accept any kind of English test to assess their English ability.
Okay, thank you. And there's another question asking about the underdegree level limit. And the question is, if the student is about 18 years old and wants to study 1 year language course plus 2 year A-levels under the Tier 4 January, what will happen to the time limit?
Yeah, there's a very specific A-level exemption, which only applies because normally, obviously, for a 2-year A-level course, the visa length they will get is over 2 years, and therefore, if the student was already 18 and they're applying for A-levels, then they would, in theory, because of the 2-year limit, never be able to get an A-level visa. However, there is an exemption that is specifically there for A-level students that are new to the UK, so they've never studied before. And if they are coming to study A-levels, coming to the UK for the first time, if they are over 18, so therefore Tier 4 General, then there is an exemption that would allow the students to get the normal visa length, but it has to be, the exemption allows them to have a visa length that's so the A-levels, and as long as the visa is less than, I think it's just less than 3 years, the visa length total, then they are okay. So if they were going to do a full year of English and then A-levels, if they were over 18, I would probably strongly recommend that first year of English is studied on one of the visitor visa routes, because then that full period would be exempt, whether it's the extended one or the 6-month one, depending on how long they're going to do it for. Because if they're over 18, a full year of English plus full 2 years of A-levels, that's a course period of nearly 3 years. The visa length is going to be over 3 years. And if they're over 18, then I don't think they'll be eligible. If they're under 18 and they wanted to do that, then I would suggest and highly recommend they apply, obviously, as a Tier 4 child for the A-level course, and therefore they could do the A-levels and the English as a single course on a single visa as a Tier 4 child, because they would be exempt from the 2-year limit as a Tier 4 child.
Okay. Thanks. And there's another question regarding the IELTS for UKVI as well. So the question is, if somebody has taken IELTS in October 2015, and now that center has been proven not to be the UKVI approved center, can he use that old IELTS? I guess the answer is no, right?
It would depend. If it was a UKVI approved testing center and the IELTS they have is a UKVI approved IELTS with the UKVI number on it, we might be able to take that if for some reason the testing center is no longer valid. We would probably, in that situation, check with our contact, because obviously at one point it was an approved center and it was an approved IELTS test, so we would just check that validity just to make sure. But I would be hopeful, as long as it had a UKVI number on the test, that we could take it. If you're talking about the student has taken a normal standard IELTS that is not UKVI approved test, then we won't be able to accept that regardless of when they took it, if they need a CELT. Obviously, if there's any reason that student is CELT exempt, then we can accept it. But if they're not CELT exempt, if it's not a UKVI approved IELTS, regardless of when it was taken, unfortunately we won't be able to accept that. So.
Okay, cool. There's another question regarding the Tier 4 child student visa holder. Agents asking, does that mean the student do not need to provide maintenance fee, for example, bank statements, if the full boarding fee for the first year is paid?
Yeah, if it's Bellaby's Tier 4 child student staying in residence or host family, if they need to show the tuition fees plus the accommodation fees. If they have paid those fees in full, and that is represented on the CAS, then actually they don't have to show any money in their account, because the outstanding balance is zero, and therefore there is no outstanding money to show in their bank account. They are the only type of student that can have zero to show, because they could pay tuition fees and accommodation fees together in full, and therefore we would reflect that on the CAS, and therefore the outstanding balance would be 0.
Okay, but do they still need to provide relevant financial documents?
No, because there's nothing to show. When they're filling out the visa application form, it will ask whether there is any outstanding balance, and obviously they will enter tuition accommodation fees as shown on the CAS. They will enter how much they paid as per the CAS, and then the outstanding balance will be 0, and therefore they won't be required to submit any financial evidence.
Okay, cool. So we have some questions regarding the case studies as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I see there are 2 questions regarding the case study 3, number C.
Sure.
So they are asking, while the student turned 18 after the first foundation course, why is it 12 months counted towards the 2-year limit instead of 10? Because some of agents are saying it's from October to August, so it should be 10 months.
Let's have a look. That might just be my calculations. I'll have a quick double check, see what was written. There we go. Student C. Mm-hmm. Yes. Turned October. June. June. Yes, sorry, that's correct. Yeah, that's just a mathematical error. Yeah, no, absolutely correct. Yeah, it'd be obviously. I think it's just a typing error rather than a calculation. But yeah, you're right. As we said, it will be calculated from the 18th birthday, which will be the 12th of October, up to the 16th of August, which is the end of the visa, and therefore whatever that period is, which is correctly 10 months, not 12. So based on having used up 10 months worth of the 2 years since turning 18, that would mean that the student actually has, as you rightly pointed out, about 14 months available. And so as long as the next course, as long as the visa length was going to be less than 14 months, then they would be eligible for another course below degree level.
Okay, cool. I actually have a question as well. I remembered when we calculate the course length, we normally say if the course is starting, probably say on even the 30th of say September, we do count that September as a 1 full month length into the course length as well. Does that still remain the same in the new rule? Or do we count those days?
Yeah, unfortunately, the UKVI calculate months in different ways depending on different things. When you're calculating the monthly living costs for finances, the UKVI will, any part of a month, they will always calculate that as a full month. So for finances, if the student is studying for the duration of the course is 8 months and 2 days, then you need to calculate the living costs for 9 months. However, for the maximum time below degree level calculation, they are being a little bit more generous. It's a bit of an unknown factor, but they tend to be calculating if the period of the visa, for example, is 7 months and 6 days, then they are generally calculating that as 7 months. But if it's 7 months and 20 days, then they're calculating that as 8 months. So it seems to be around, as long as it's sort of a month and less than a half, then they will round it down to the 7 months, for example. But if it's a month and more than a half, then they will round it up to the next month. If we have a situation where any student is, based on the amount of time they have remaining, if it's going to be very, very tight, if they have 11 months remaining and the visa length they get will be 11 months or maybe 12 months, depending on how you would calculate it, then what we would probably do to obviously avoid a visa refusal and a wasted CAS and avoid a lot of problems for the student, in those kinds of situations we would probably check first, just to make sure to understand that we have calculated it how the UKVI would calculate it, and then based on their response, if they say that yeah, that's absolutely fine, then we can go ahead and issue the CAS. But if for any reason they say no, this would definitely be calculated at 12 months and the student only had 11 months left, then at least we're aware of that before the student applies, before we issue the CAS, and therefore we can work with the agent and the student to come up with a alternative study plan that will fit within what we now know would be an 11-month period.
Okay, cool. Thanks. Also, we have another question with the case studies as well. So they ask for case B and C, why is the student in case B can be examined as the start of the program, where case C, the student can be only examined when they turn 18?
Let's have a look at B.
This is because of the visa type they have.
In B, they are a Tier 4 child, and therefore it's actually irrelevant that they turned 18. So therefore, the full length of that Tier 4 child visa is exempt, regardless of whether they turn 18 or not. Obviously, we've included that just to highlight that point. Whereas in C, there was a Tier 4 general, and therefore we could only exempt the period before they were 18. And therefore, from 18, as a Tier 4 general, we had to calculate from their 18th birthday to the end of the visa. But as a Tier 4 child, it doesn't matter if they're under or over 18, the full duration of that visa is exempt, and we would not include that in any calculation.
Okay, thanks. An agent is asking if the undergraduate level study length is going to be having an impact on the existing visa. So for the student who has already applied for their Tier 4 general visa, probably back in October, September 2015, will that have an impact on them?
No, it's only the new rule of the 2 years only impacts new visa applications since the sort of 12th of November.
Okay.
So if a student applied before that, even if they don't have the visa outcome yet, then the new rules do not apply because they submitted their application before the change. If a student has a visa, whether they are not yet here and coming in January or whether they are currently studying, their visa is valid for until it finishes. The only impact it will have to current student is obviously what they can or can't do next, because we may have been able to issue them a CAS before the changes. Maybe they had previously studied nearly 2 years. But because before November the rules were 3 years, then we were able to issue them a CAS. They got a visa, they're fine to carry on studying and finish, but obviously if at the end of the current course, if that meant that now they've studied more than 2 years or nearly 2 years below degree level and none of it is exempt, then obviously the impact will be on their next application that if they have used up all of their allowed 2 years, then there will be no more below degree level options for those students, their next application.
Okay, cool, thanks. So there's another question about if the student has studied at A-level in the UK and has really good grades in English in their A-levels, can they be exempt for the IELTS for UKVI requirement?
Unfortunately, only if they studied A-levels as a Tier 4 child.
Okay.
If they did it as a Tier 4 child, then even if they're applying for the next course as a Tier 4 general, then they are exempt because they completed a course as a Tier 4 child. If they studied it as a Tier 4 general, unfortunately, they will not be exempt. So I would always recommend for A-level students, if the student is under 18, I would always highly recommend that they apply as a Tier 4 child, because there are no benefits to applying as a Tier 4 general for under 18 students for A-levels.
Okay, thanks. There are still quite a lot of questions here. So there is a question with a student coming at Tier 4 for the pre-sessional English course.
Mm-hmm.
Do they need a nursery letter for the child student visa before bringing him as a dependent?
If the student is coming to do a pre-sessional and wants to bring a child as a dependent, then they need to make an application to do that before they come, to get that child a dependent visa, which will be done in their needs to be done in their home country, and is normally done at the same time as the main Tier 4 application. However, I think there are ways to do it as a separate application. If the student already has a Tier 4 visa and now wants to bring a child, then it is possible, but yeah, they'll have to arrange all of that before they leave for the UK and have to do that at home.
Okay, thanks. There is a question about living costs as well for students who are only going to study a course less than 9 months.
Mm-hmm.
Does that mean that they only need to provide financial evidence based on the course length?
Yes. Yeah. So if it's always a maximum of 9 months. So if the course is over 9 months, then the student only shows 9 months. However, if the course duration is less than 9 months, then they show the living costs for the duration of the course only. So, for example, 6 months. However, as we mentioned, for the living costs calculation, the UKVI always calculate any tiny bit of a month as a full month. So if the course is 5 months and even 5 months and 1 day, then the student will need to have 6 months. We would always recommend as well, if the course length, which does happen, if the course length is exactly, for example, exactly 4 months. Now, that can be interpreted either way. We would always recommend, where possible, having obviously more money. So if the course duration resulted in it being exactly 4 months long, to avoid any problems, we would probably suggest the student has enough for 5 months, just to avoid any potential refusals in case the UKVI calculate that they might see that as sort of 4 months and a day rather than just 4 months. When it's a specifically exact amount, that can sometimes cause problems. But if it's less than 9 months, taking into account that bits of a month are always a full month, they only have to show the duration according to the course dates.
Okay, thank you. There's another question. I think this is only like 3 questions left. So the next question is, if a student is issued a Tier 4 January student visa in August 2015 for International Year 1 course, for example, a duration of 10 months, so his visa is issued for 12 months. However, he is advised to do a EAP for 6 months upon arrival. Can the student extend his visa to cover the remaining of the International Year 1 course?
It will, unfortunately, the answer to these kind of things will always be it depends, because we would have to factor in any other previous study, because if they're doing International Year 1, then they may have studied A-levels or foundation before, and again, whether that was as a child or as a general or over 18, under 18, that would all have to be factored in, because that will have to, we would have to take account the previous study before the International Year 1, and whether that counts towards the 2 years. We would then have to take into account the international year one period of the visa, and then if they therefore need to do an extension, whether it's to resit exams or whether it's to cover any English language that has been added, then we would have to factor in that the visa they will get for the extension falls within the time they have remaining. So changes to study plans that are made when after the student has arrived, obviously these new rules are now being factored in by the Belarus College staff or by the ISE Centre staff because they're fully aware that a student has a visa for example, international year one, as you say, and previously it may be that additional term of ELP would have been added because the student wasn't quite ready, and therefore they would have then done an extension at the end of the course just to cover that. But now, before those decisions are made, the heads of centre and the principals and the academic teams are fully aware of these new rules. We've done a lot of work with them, and they now know that they have to take that into account before any such decision can be made, because obviously they don't want to adversely affect the student, and there's no point making a change if the student then cannot complete the course at the end because they cannot make an extension.
Okay, thanks. Also, there's some question regarding the students who failed their previous foundation. What kind of options do the students have? Is it possible for them to be accepted to repeat the foundation with us?
It's possible. As always, we would have to factor in all of the information. Why did they fail the previous foundation? What was their attendance? Things like that. Because obviously, if a student had extremely poor attendance before, then we might not want to issue that student a CAS to protect ourselves. However, generally, if a student's previously studied foundation, if we feel we can justify, excuse me, if we feel we can justify why we are issuing another CAS at the same level, then we generally do, but the student will have to go home to make that application.
Okay, thanks. So are you considering issuing more combined classes to cover both pathway and degree courses and IC and our partner universities?
Yes, that is something we're obviously looking at with our pathway, with our partner universities. That obviously is one, because that CAS, even though it's for the pathway plus the degree, the CAS is issued at NQF level 6 and therefore is not actually included in this 2-year limit. There are some drawbacks to the combined CAS approach. For example, as the CAS is level 6, then the student needs to have an English language level of B2, which is much higher at 5.5. So that has implications on whether a student will be able to, and that's to even start the foundation because the CAS has been issued. There are ways around that, but it is a complex thing. However, yes, obviously with the rules changing based on eligibility to apply inside the UK and the maximum time allowed, etc. We are working with our university partners to offer a wide range of different options so that we can, we want to maximize the options for all students so that we can try and find the most suitable solution for every student, whether that's a CAS from us or whether that's a CAS from the university through a combined program. So yeah, we hope to have news on that in 2016.
All right, thanks, Ian. And there's about a few questions left, so just going to quickly go through this. So there's a question about the current foundation Philippines student with Tier 4 general student visa, and the IELTS was taken during the summer in 2015, so obviously not UKVI version. The student is planning to start in the university in September 2016. Does that mean the student will still need to book IELTS for UKVI test?
The advice I would always give in such situations is the student needs to talk to the university that they are going to, because I can tell you the rules, which are students going to study their degree with the universities. Universities are exempt for courses at degree level. Universities are exempt from needing a UKVI CELT. Universities they have to assess the student to show that the student is B2 or 5.5 in all skills minimum, but it does not have to be a UKVI IELTS. Universities are allowed to use any testing method that they are happy with. However, some universities still insist on a UKVI IELTS, therefore I would not, because the university is issuing the CAS and it's the students progressing there, I can't confirm either way as to what the university will want, but I would obviously, before going out and booking one, speak to the admissions people at the university, and I'm sure they'll be happy to advise as to whether or not what the student currently has is acceptable or not.
Okay, thank you. There's also a question around the NQF level for our foundation course. I guess that's NQF level 3, isn't it?
Yes.
Okay.
A-levels and foundation are both NQF 3. Foundation, Bellerbys or ISE, they're both NQF 3. And the international year 1 is NQF 4, and the equivalent at Bellerbys is also NQF 4.
Okay. So there's another question about if the student is studying for international year 1 course and Bellerbys and ISEs, is IELTS required for UKVI version?
If they're studying international year 1, yes. Any course with Bellerbys or the ICs, except if the student is exempt for any reason, as outlined in the presentation. I outlined all the different exemptions, but if they're not applying as a Tier 4 child, or if they haven't previously studied as a Tier 4 child, or they're not one of the exempt nationalities, then for both foundation, A-levels, and the IY1 courses, we will always need a UKVI CELT, unless, as I said, unless they meet one of those exemptions.
Okay, cool. If we say the student can be exempt for IELTS, whether it's a child or student visa or if they meet any of the exempt requirements, what kind of documents do we need in order to assess the English level of the students? I guess it's more like an admission question in there.
Yeah, it's a little bit admissions. I mean, it will depend. Obviously, we still need to receive something that suitably assesses the student English, because that is still, although the student is exempt from the CELT requirement, we still, as a sponsor and also as an education institute, we still need to know an accurate level of the student to ensure that, we offer the student the correct study plan. Now, obviously, there are lots and lots of different test types. If the student does not need a CELT, then obviously there are many, many different types, including our own study group tests. But I know that there are slight differences between Bellerbys and the ICs as to what can and cannot be accepted. So I think that would be best one aimed at admissions to be able to definitely give you exactly what it is that we can and cannot accept. But if they are exempt from CELT, then it definitely doesn't have to be a UKVI IELTS at all.
Okay, thanks. I think we have one last question here, which is not entirely relevant to our subjects today, but I just read it out for you so you can advise. So there's an agent who has a question about a mother who's got 2 children with the age of 10 and 12 who will be coming to the UK to study as under a Tier 4 child visa. So she's asking if the mother can come to the UK as well as a dependent of these children, and what's the procedure is regarding this.
It's not something that we offer because we do not accept students that young.
Yeah.
It's not something we have a lot of experience with. Now, I do know that if a student is under 12, then there is a special visa that parents can apply for, which is, I can't remember the name of it, but it's a visa to accompany such students to the UK. Because they are so young, obviously UKVI recognise that they need to have their parents with them. It's very beneficial, it's much safer. Unfortunately, I don't know the full procedure of that or exactly how that's done. So I would recommend they sort of contact the best people that will be able to advise is obviously the institute where those students are studying, because obviously if they accept students that young, then they would have experience of that. And they'll be able, I'm sure they'll be more than happy to help the student and the mother with the information that they need.
Okay, cool. Thanks very much, Ian. I think that's all the questions answered. We will send you the presentation slides after the session. And also, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to your PSMs, and we will make sure that your answers are provided ASAP. Thanks very much for attending the training today again, and hopefully it can be really helpful in terms of student counseling moving forward. And everybody have a good weekend, and hopefully speak to you soon.
Okay. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.